Greetings, Life Groups. I'm Josh. I'm one of the pastors here at Quad City, and we're in week 2 of our Transformed series. This week, we're talking all about how to use worldly wealth. I know last week, Ken's video, he kind of recapped the sermon and then left you with some questions to answer after the end. Well, this week, we're going to do it a little bit differently. So we're going to still recap the sermon, but actually throughout this reminder, this recap of this past Sunday's message, there's going to be 5 opportunities for you to pause and answer a question on the screen. Ideally, each question is probably 5 or 10 minutes or so for your group to engage with and answer. But as always, if the conversation is rich and full and you're not on a time limit, man, keep going. But we do just want to make you aware that there are questions all the way throughout this entire video because we don't want you to miss out on what we're talking about. So with that, let's dive in further and ask ourselves, how can we apply what we heard this Sunday to our lives? So I want to actually start our time with a couple of questions. So Jason spoke about a few of the reasons why people seek to make money. He mentioned security, independence, comfort, status, legacy, and charity. So here's the question I want you to answer. Of these, which one is the one that you tend to fall into the most? Well, hey, welcome back. Again, what we know is that no one wants money for money's sake. We want money because of what it can provide. But as we dig into this week's parable, as we already heard, I want to remind us that maybe there's a bigger goal, a loftier goal when it comes to having money. Again, our parable is found in Luke 16. As you're turning there, I know many of you probably never even heard this parable taught in church. I'm guessing not a lot of you have studied this or dug deeper into this parable. And really, it's because when you read it and when you hear it, it's kind of hard to understand. We just want to let you know again and remind you that if you want to hear more and learn more about this conversation and this week's text, we do that in our podcast. And we would just remind you that if you've got some questions, you can hopefully listen to this week's podcast and we can try to help answer those as well. With that, let's dive in. Starting in verse 1. Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and he asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you cannot be manager any longer. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job, but I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. So Jesus starts the parable by setting the scene. There's a man who is rich, and so rich that he has someone else taking care of his money. It sounds like that our manager is over his accounts with others. And for some reason, the manager is accused of wasting his boss's money. He's not good at his job. And so obviously, if you're the boss, you can't let that slide. So he tells the manager that his time has come to an end. He tells him, you're fired. Our manager, though, he knows himself. He knows that maybe he really can't do anything else. He knows like working out in the fields, that's not an option he wants to pursue. Now, there isn't like a classified ad in the paper, or there isn't ZipRecruiter where you can fire up the internet and find something. And he says, I don't want to beg. That's not an option for me either. So before the paperwork is processed, our manager, he comes up with a plan. Back in verse 4, says, I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each one of his master's debtors. And he asked the first, now how much do you owe my master? 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. So the manager, he starts calling all his boss's outstanding accounts. He tells him, look, what I'm going to do for you is the first guy, I'm going to cut your account in half. And for the other one, he says, I'm going to discount it by 20%. Which, like, this is amazing if you're the ones with the debts. I can't imagine that the boss is thrilled. So I just want to stop for a minute. I want to let you guys as a group actually chat about this. So here's the question. Do you think the manager is good or bad? Why would you say he's good? Why would you say he's bad? If you're the boss or the ones giving the discount, does that matter? All right, well, welcome back. You know what's so interesting is that as Jesus continues the parable, the conversation isn't actually about good or bad. That's how we like to frame it. But the point is that Jesus calls this man smart. Verse 8, Jesus says, the master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. That word shrewd brings up some different reactions when you hear it, I'm sure. You know, personally, when I have read this story before, even as we read this story as a team to help process as we were going to teach it, it's that word that I struggled with. And so it was helpful for me to understand better what that word meant, the word shrewd, and really the culture around it. So really simply, the word means cunning and wise. Or maybe a better way to say it is, it's not just about having book smarts, but our guy has street smarts. How many of you heard that from folks growing up? Maybe it's just a Southern thing. I remember always being asked, do I want to have book smarts or street smarts? Well, apparently in Jesus's culture, having street smarts was not looked down on. You see, our guy, he wasn't going to keep his job. The manager's still going to be jobless. The boss is still going to fire him. But before the boss could do that, the manager came up with a plan. You know what the boss should have done is he should have made him clean out his office a little faster. He should have took away access to the company phone. But again, before he did all of that, before all of that happened, our manager had that plan. And it says that the boss knew that this was a really smart plan. But what does that have to do with us? What does it have to do with how we use our wealth, the resources that we have access to? Well, Jesus says in verse 9, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. Don't miss this. Jesus looks at his followers because that's who he's talking to. And he says the world, it has more street smarts. They operate more wisely when it comes to using their finances for gain. He says they actually know how to leverage the things they have to set them up for something even greater later. And Jesus, he thinks we should be more like them. Again, he keeps going. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Jesus says, use wealth in a way so that when it's gone, it sets you up to gain eternal dwellings, to be shrewd. You're shrewd and cunning. You take everything you've been given and use it to its maximum potential so that we make a difference in this world. Not a difference for us, but so that the world knows more about Jesus. And in doing so, people find freedom and salvation and eternal life. Which begs the question I want you to talk about. Do you want more than anything else to have you and all those around you who you know and love to be in heaven with Jesus for all eternity? But we don't have to answer that question. I think, or I hope all of us would say yes and amen to that. The real question is, how are you currently leveraging your worldly wealth to make sure that happens? Well, welcome back. Hopefully you heard some encouraging things from those in your group. And maybe that conversation spurred you to think about how you could actually do some of those things. How you could do more to use what you've been given and ways to grow God's kingdom. And the reason we do this, the reason we're focused not on things of this world, but on God's kingdom is the reminder that Jason gave us on Sunday. We're not people of this world. We belong to a different kingdom with a different king. You and I are not to try and gain worldly wealth for the sole purpose of using it to run after worldly goals. Jesus is telling us, he's calling us to use the wealth that we've been given for eternal purposes, to invest in things that the world may not think have value now, but we know have value for all eternity. So Jesus is telling us to be cunning, to be smart, to be wise, to have street smarts. Yeah, we're to be honorable. Don't miss that. We are to be honorable, but use the system that we have access to, the systems of this world, to create and generate wealth so that you can, and this is key, leverage it all, not to grow your fame and your name and your kingdom here on earth, but to do all that you can to make sure that everyone you know, and even those you don't, have access to know the good news of the gospel. That's what this is all about. That Jesus is entrusting you with wealth and wants you to use it to its maximum potential. And here's the question I want you to talk through now as a group. Does your use of worldly wealth align more with the wishes and value of your current home, the world, or our eternal home? Well, welcome back. Let's finish with the words of Jesus as he concludes this parable with really now what is his teaching about the parable. He says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? Verse 13, no one can serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And then the Pharisees, who loved money, heard all of this and were sneering at Jesus. And he said to them, you are the ones who justify yourself in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight. So I've got a few more questions as you wrestle with what you just heard, those words of Jesus. A few questions to help you evaluate and gauge how you're becoming a better disciple of Jesus as we look at this area of generosity. So here are the questions. What are some examples of small things in your life where you need to be faithful? What steps can you take to cultivate a heart that values God over material possessions? And what practical steps can you take this week to be more faithful with the resources and responsibilities God has given to you? After you finish answering those, I've got one last thing I want to leave you with. Well, hey, welcome back. Again, just one last reminder. I want to leave you with the same thought to ponder that we did on Sunday as you end your group. What this world values is detestable in God's sight. That is the words of Jesus. Which means if our greatest investments are in the things the world values most, then our hearts need to be transformed. And so this week, as you go about your week, ask yourself, ponder, where am I investing my wealth? If it doesn't align with what Jesus calls us to, it's time that our hearts are transformed. Well, thanks for joining in with us this week. Man, I hope your group time was rich and full and enjoyable. I hope there was amazing conversations. And ultimately, I hope all of you are becoming better disciples of Jesus. We'll see you back here next week.